The racist cop took the black woman to court and mocked her, but then panicked when she showed her FBI badge. It started like too many stories do, like something you've heard before, something you wish was fiction, but it isn't. A black woman, dressed professionally, composed, quiet, had just entered a small-town courtroom with nothing in her hands but a file folder and a calm look in her eyes. She wasn't late. She wasn't loud. She wasn't doing anything wrong. And still, she became the center of a storm. The moment she walked in, one white officer fixed his gaze on her like she didn't belong. Like the room itself recoiled at her presence. She tried to find her seat, but before she could take another step, the officer stood in her path and said something that cut through the quiet murmurs in the room like a knife. "What do you think you're doing here, huh? Lost, or just casing the place?" His voice echoed through the courtroom. Some people chuckled quietly. Others just looked away, pretending not to hear. She answered, calm, dignified, "I'm here for the hearing." But he wasn't listening. His mind was already made up. He squinted at her. "You don't belong here. I saw your type before. What, you think dressing up in some office clothes makes you innocent? I bet you've been in and out of this courthouse your whole life." She barely blinked. She just repeated, "I'm here for the hearing." Then, with a condescending smile on his face, he walked toward her and, without warning, pulled out his cuffs. "You know what, let's not play games today. Turn around. Hands behind your back." She hesitated, confused, disoriented by the absurdity of what was happening. She hadn't done a single thing wrong. "I think there's been a mistake," she said, but her voice was drowned out by the clinking of metal. The officer twisted her arms behind her, locked the cuffs, and walked her toward the front of the courtroom like a prize he just hunted down. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said loudly, looking at the judge, the jury box, the gallery, "looks like we got ourselves another one trying to fake her way into court. I swear, they're getting bolder every week." The judge raised his brow but didn't intervene. The people whispered. She stood there, shackled, humiliated, erased. She wasn't just insulted. She was erased. Stripped of identity in one moment. Judged not by her actions or her record or her dignity, but by her skin, her presence, her silence. That was the crime, apparently, daring to walk in there, thinking she had a place among them. But what no one knew, not the smug cop, not the half-asleep judge, not the spectators watching her as if she was on trial for existing, was that she had walked into that courtroom not as a defendant, not as a trespasser, but with a purpose far greater than any of them could imagine. She had come not to be judged, but to bring judgment. Because while they saw her as another nameless black woman, she was, in truth, the highest-ranking officer in a federal operation designed to uncover corruption in local law enforcement. And he, this officer with the smirk, the arrogance, the casual cruelty, he wasn't just a racist. He was the subject of an active federal investigation. He just didn't know that the person he humiliated in front of an entire courtroom was his reckoning wrapped in silence. The same silence he mocked was the silence that would end him. She had waited months for this. Had built the case piece by piece. Names. Photos. Statements. Bodycam footage that mysteriously disappeared. Witnesses too afraid to speak. Colleagues who covered for him. A pattern of behavior masked by false reports and a badge that shielded hate. She watched from the inside, gathering every detail, every abuse, until the pattern became undeniable. He made a mistake that day, not just in assuming who she was, but in choosing to humiliate her in the very room where she had arranged his downfall. The courtroom didn't know it yet, but it was about to become the stage for the most public fall from power that county had ever seen. Because inside her folder, there wasn't a defense or a plea. There was an arrest warrant. Not for her, but for him. Authorized. Sealed. Ready to be served. By her. When the judge finally asked for her name, she looked him in the eye and said nothing. Instead, she reached into her pocket. The same pocket the officer had ignored during his unlawful arrest. She pulled out a badge, shiny, heavy, official. The gold and blue glint under the fluorescent lights. The room fell silent. Every head turned. Even the officer's smirk cracked. He took a step back, like someone realizing the floor beneath him wasn't solid anymore. What is this? Some kind of joke. But it wasn't a joke. It was justice. The kind that doesn't come loud, but arrives in silence and precision. The kind that doesn't scream, it exposes. The kind that makes everyone who laughed at her, who looked past her, who believed she was less than, feel the weight of their own complicity. She didn't shout. She didn't threaten. She handed the judge the folder. Inside were charges. Felony misconduct. Obstruction of justice. Hate crime. Forgery. Excessive force. And it all had one name on top. His. The very man who had cuffed her in front of everyone. The courtroom that mocked her gasped in unison as reality hit. The predator wasn't standing in handcuffs. He was wearing a badge. And the woman they all judged. She was justice itself. But what she did next, after the badge was shown, after the warrant was handed over, after the shock began to settle, was something no one could have predicted. Something that not only exposed his crimes, but flipped the entire power structure of that town upside down. Because she had more than a badge. She had leverage. And one move, just one choice, would decide not only his fate, but the fate of every corrupt hand tied to his. So the question is, what did she do next? And why did the entire room go silent when she opened her mouth? Stay until the end. You won't believe how far she went. And why every person in that courtroom will never forget the day she walked in. At Plow of Twist, we stand firmly against any form of racism or discrimination. To every black viewer watching this, your life, your story, and your dignity matter, and they always will. This channel is a safe space where justice, truth, and representation take the front seat. We're proud to share stories that echo strength, resilience, and powerful comebacks. Now sit back, because what you're about to hear is more than just a story, it's a statement. Don't forget to subscribe to Plow of Twist and hit that like button to support stories that matter. Enjoy the story. Atlanta breathed in rhythms, chaotic, fast, pulsing with ambition and inequality at every corner. It was a city where progress met resistance, where skyscrapers cast shadows over neighborhoods that hadn't seen investment in decades. But somewhere between the polished court buildings of downtown and the cracked sidewalks of East Point, lived a woman who had spent her entire life learning how to move through both worlds without ever being fully accepted in either. Her name was Imani Walker, and she had built herself from silence, strategy, and scars. She wasn't the type to make noise when she entered a room, but when she spoke, people felt like she had been listening to them long before they said anything. There was weight in her gaze. Command in her stillness. Imani was born to a single mother who worked nights at Grady Hospital, balancing exhaustion and love like a second skin. Her father was a name she rarely said and a memory she never chased. Their two-bedroom apartment had a leaky faucet, a front door that stuck in the summer, and a wall full of framed school certificates and newspaper clippings from Black excellence stories her mother swore would one day include Imani's name. It wasn't a rich life. But it was full, of discipline, of expectations, of unspoken lessons about how the world would see her and how she had to fight harder just to be seen fully. She didn't dream of joining the FBI as a child. She dreamed of being safe. Of being taken seriously. Of walking into a room and not having to prove herself 3 times before being allowed to speak once. Law enforcement, for her, wasn't glamour. It was survival. It was infiltration. A way to get close to the systems that had always held a knife to her community's throat. And once she entered the bureau, she didn't carry her badge like a trophy. She wore it like armor. Now in her mid-30s, Imani had become one of the most respected internal affairs agents in the Southern Division. Her cases were always discreet, always strategic. She didn't chase headlines, she chased patterns. Paper trails. Whispers between departments. The kind of misconduct that slipped through cracks, hidden under bureaucracy and off-the-record handshakes. She had developed a reputation for never rushing to judgment, but when she moved, her precision was surgical. No one ever saw her coming until the doors closed and they were sitting across from her, faced with evidence they didn't even know she had. Outside of work, Imani's life was simple. Deliberate. She lived alone in a modest townhouse in College Park, drove a 5-year-old Nissan, and kept most people at arm's length. Her peace wasn't negotiable. She volunteered sometimes at a local mentoring program for black girls, teaching them about strength that didn't need to be loud to be powerful. But even there, she rarely talked about what she did for a living. It wasn't secrecy, it was strategy. She had learned long ago that power loses its edge when everyone knows you have it. The man at the other end of this story couldn't have been more different. Officer Ryan Halstead had been with the Atlanta Police Department for almost 15 years. On paper, he was what the city wanted from a beat cop, experienced, consistent, loyal to his precinct. In the community, though, his name told a different story. Whispers of profiling. Patterns of pulling over young black men for routine checks. Complaints that went nowhere. Bodycam footage that somehow always cut out at the wrong moment. He had the kind of arrogance that wasn't loud, but lingering, like smoke after a fire. He smiled in meetings, cracked jokes with white officers that made the black ones uncomfortable, and mastered the art of plausible deniability. Nothing ever stuck. No incident ever went far enough for full suspension. But those who'd crossed paths with him, especially women of color, remembered the way he looked at them, not with anger, but with dismissal. Like they were inconveniences. Halstead didn't know Imani Walker. Not yet. To him, she was just another unfamiliar face in the courthouse, dressed too clean, walking too straight. It wasn't just that she was black, it was that she was unbothered. Confident. She moved like someone who wasn't afraid of him, and in his world, that was enough to raise suspicion. The courthouse was his turf. The place where he strutted around like an off-duty sheriff in a western town. And when he saw her that morning, alone, calm, holding a folder and not looking around like someone who needed help, he didn't see a citizen. He saw a challenge. It had been a tense week already. Rumors had started swirling about internal audits. There had been a hush-hush memo from his lieutenant about federal investigators reviewing old complaints. Halstead didn't think much of it, he'd seen this before. A few uncomfortable meetings, a slap on the wrist, and life went on. But that morning, something in his gut twisted when he saw her. He didn't know her name. But he felt something he didn't want to admit. Threatened. So he made the move. It started with a question, fake politeness layered over hostility. He asked her why she was there. She said she had business. He asked what kind. She said it wasn't with him. He laughed, but it wasn't humor, it was warning. And then came the escalation. A random ID check. A request for documents she wasn't legally obligated to provide. A growing crowd. Raised eyebrows. And finally, the moment of humiliation. She tried to reason. To stay composed. She told him he was making a mistake. That only made him more smug. By the time he pulled the cuffs out, she was already the story of the day. Bystanders watched. Some recorded with their phones. Others whispered. The courthouse staff didn't intervene. The judge hadn't even entered yet. In less than 5 minutes, she went from walking with purpose to standing, hands behind her back, eyes forward, surrounded by the soft sounds of judgment and assumption. Halstead believed he'd won. Another day, another uncooperative suspect. He didn't care if the charges held. He just wanted control. But what he couldn't see, what no one in that room could see, was the control had never been his. Imani wasn't there by accident. She had arrived precisely on time. Every step she took that morning had been mapped out weeks in advance. Every piece of paper in that folder had passed through multiple layers of clearance. Every silence she offered was intentional. Calculated. She had come to that courthouse for one reason only, to watch a system eat one of its own from the inside out. She hadn't expected to be arrested. But she also knew better than to react. She'd been trained for moments like this, not in the academy, but in life. In every room where she had to prove her competence twice as hard. In every meeting where she was talked over, dismissed, or reduced. In every neighborhood she patrolled in silence, absorbing stories that never made headlines. This, being underestimated, was her element. And while Halstead strutted, while his colleagues made quiet jokes, while the courtroom buzzed with their favorite kind of scandal, another black woman in handcuffs, Imani waited. Because everything she needed was already in motion. The badge in her pocket. The warrant in her folder. The sealed file ready for the judge's eyes. But none of them knew that yet. And as Halstead stood beside her, confident that the humiliation was complete, she allowed him one last moment of delusion. Because when the judge called her name, and the courtroom leaned in expecting to hear a plea, they had no idea what was about to hit them. And neither did he. The hallway outside the courtroom hummed with a low, tense energy, the kind that clung to the walls and settled under the skin. Imani sat silently on a metal bench, wrists red from the cuffs that had only recently been removed. Her blazer, wrinkled at the shoulders from the rough handling, still held its form, a quiet refusal to let anyone strip away her dignity. Officers passed by without looking at her, but their silence said everything. Some recognized the badge when she revealed it to the bailiff. Others simply assumed there had been a mistake and whispered to avoid the fallout. But no one apologized. No one asked if she was okay. The damage had been done, and the silence around her screamed of complicity. She stared at the floor, not in defeat, but in still calculation. Every move from here on out mattered. She wasn't just an agent anymore. She was the center of a very public mess, and how she responded would ripple far beyond this courthouse. Her instincts told her not to react emotionally, not yet. But beneath the calm surface, her mind churned. Ryan Halstead had humiliated her in the very space she had orchestrated his exposure. And now, she had to decide if she'd proceed with the original plan, or if she would sharpen it into something more precise, more unforgettable. The courtroom doors opened behind her, and a familiar voice broke the tension. "Agent Walker," came the low, controlled tone of Special Agent Marcus Ellison, her partner on this case for over a year. His eyes scanned her face, concern laced into his usually unshakable calm. "You all right?" She didn't answer immediately. When she looked up at him, her eyes weren't angry, they were focused. "They want to push this into a corner," she said. "Make it look like a misunderstanding, a glitch in the process." Marcus exhaled through his nose and leaned against the wall beside her. "I spoke with the judge. They're trying to fast-track the hearing. No mention of misconduct. Just, bureaucratic noise. They think if they sweep fast enough, no one will notice what happened." "They're wrong," she replied, almost a whisper. The weight of the moment hung between them. For a year, they'd followed leads that seemed to vanish the moment they got close. Files that disappeared. Testimonies retracted. Victims who changed stories after late-night visits from anonymous uniforms. They knew Halstead was just one piece of a broader network, a culture within the department, protected from the inside. But Imani hadn't expected him to expose himself so publicly, to make her the victim in such a blatant act of racial profiling. And now, that humiliation wasn't just personal. It was tactical. They couldn't afford to move softly anymore. Inside the courtroom, Ryan Halstead adjusted his collar and leaned back in his chair like a man who believed the storm had passed. The judge gave him a nod as he reviewed the morning's docket, casual, unaffected. Halstead had been in that room dozens of times. Knew every bailiff, every clerk. He was comfortable, surrounded by the same network that had always had his back. What he didn't know, what none of them knew, was that Imani had already submitted the final affidavit. That the Bureau had authorized immediate action pending final confirmation. That today wasn't about closing the case quietly. It was about making an example. Back in the hallway, Marcus opened a small folder and handed Imani a phone. "It's already circulating," he said. She tapped the screen and watched the video play, grainy, shot on a bystander's phone, but clear enough. The moment Halstead handcuffed her. The smirk. The words. The laughter in the background. The face of a woman who knew this wasn't new. It had already racked up nearly 500,000 views on social media. Imani shook her head slowly. "It's bigger than him now," she muttered. "He's going to play the protocol card," Marcus warned. "He'll say he was following procedure. Suspicious person, uncooperative, no ID presented immediately. He'll wrap it up in language designed to protect him. And most people in that room will eat it up like they always do." "Not this time," she said. "They already swallowed the lie. Now they're going to choke on the truth." She stood, brushing the creases from her pants, and walked toward the courtroom door with Marcus at her side. Her badge now rested plainly on her belt, visible to all. She wasn't hiding it anymore. Let them look. Let them wonder how they got it so wrong. Let them realize too late who they had tried to silence. Inside, the judge called her case, his voice neutral, as if nothing unusual had happened. Halstead didn't even flinch when she walked in. If anything, he looked amused. His legs crossed, one hand tapping on the table, the other resting lazily near the mic. "Let's proceed," the judge said. Imani sat down calmly, opened the folder Marcus handed her, and placed it on the table. For a moment, no one spoke. The air felt thick. Halstead leaned over, eyes narrowed, his voice barely above a whisper. "Didn't expect you to come back in here so soon. Most people would have filed a complaint and disappeared." She didn't look at him. "I'm not most people." "Oh, I figured that out the moment you pulled that badge. Gotta admit, that was a nice touch." Had the whole room shook. His grin lingered. But Imani turned slowly toward him, her voice low but cutting. "You're smiling like you still think this ends with a handshake and a sealed report. You really think today's about embarrassment?" He blinked, the smile fading just slightly. "Today," she said, "is about exposure." Before he could respond, the clerk announced that the hearing was now on record. The judge looked at Imani and asked if she had any opening remarks or clarifications. She rose to her feet, her movements slow and deliberate, and nodded. "I do," she said. But instead of speaking into the mic, she walked up to the judge's bench and handed over a sealed document, one the court hadn't expected. The judge raised an eyebrow and opened it slowly. Inside were the preliminary charges, signed and dated by a federal prosecutor. His eyes scanned the names, the allegations, the timestamps. Then his face shifted. It was a barely noticeable change, just a tightening around the mouth, a flicker of discomfort in the eyes. But it was enough to let Imani know the message had landed. The judge cleared his throat and leaned into the mic. "Due to new information submitted by federal authorities, we'll be pausing the current docket pending review." Murmurs filled the room. Halstead leaned forward, confused. "What's going on?" The judge didn't answer. Imani did. She turned to face the room, voice steady, unwavering. "You wanted me silent. You wanted me gone. But what you really did, was give me an audience." She sat back down, calm as ever, while across the room, Halstead began to shift in his seat. The confidence drained slowly from his face as he looked around and realized, no one was making eye contact. Not the clerk. Not the bailiffs. Not even the judge. And still, he didn't know what was coming next. He had no idea that the very next word spoken in that courtroom would change everything. Because the story wasn't over. It hadn't even begun. The room didn't go quiet all at once. It was more like a wave, slow, rolling, as realization spread. The sound of papers rustling stopped. The judge's pen froze mid-sentence. A cough near the back was quickly swallowed. Halstead shifted in his chair, eyes scanning the courtroom like he was trying to catch some sign, some signal, some confirmation that what was happening wasn't actually happening. But it was. The sealed folder in the judge's hands wasn't just a disruption to the morning schedule, it was a reckoning. Imani didn't need to explain anything with words. Not yet. She let the silence stretch just long enough for everyone to sit with their discomfort. She had waited for this moment with a patience only trauma teaches. The judge cleared his throat again, voice suddenly tight, almost forced. He looked directly at Halstead, but there was no familiarity in his eyes this time. Only protocol. Officer Halstead, he began slowly, in light of evidence submitted under federal authority, you are being placed under administrative detainment pending further instruction from the U.S. Department of Justice. Halstead blinked like he hadn't heard correctly. His head jerked slightly toward Imani, then back to the judge. What? What the hell is this? The judge didn't respond. Imani rose from her chair with the kind of composure that stings. She walked slowly toward the center of the room, stopping directly in front of Halstead, her eyes never leaving his. The courtroom leaned forward, collectively holding its breath. You thought this day was about me, she said, her voice firm but calm, as if she were reciting a report. You thought your actions this morning were just another routine flex of power, another mistake covered in a few lines of paper and silence. He opened his mouth to respond, but she continued, cutting off whatever excuse he was forming. This investigation has been ongoing for 16 months. Internal files, redacted reports, surveillance, deleted body cam footage, we have it all. You weren't just careless, Ryan. You were arrogant. You didn't just abuse your power, you documented it with a smile. He stood up now, face reddening, voice rising in panic. No, this is insane. This is personal. You're setting me up. Imani didn't flinch. You did that yourself. Marcus entered the room through the side door, walking briskly toward the front, holding a black duffel bag. He unzipped it and pulled out a laptop, placing it on the desk with methodical precision. Imani didn't have to say a word. She clicked a button, and the screen came to life. The image projected onto the courtroom monitor wasn't flashy. Just a paused frame from a surveillance video, a time-stamped clip from 7 months ago. Halstead, outside a convenience store. A young black teenager face down on the pavement. Halstead's boot on his back. No aggression. No resistance. The boy wasn't even the suspect. Just a kid walking home. The audio clicked on. Does this hurt? Good, Halstead's voice echoed, crisp and undeniable. Gasps rippled through the gallery. Another video. A woman, handcuffed in the back of a squad car, quietly crying. Halstead's voice again, laughing in the front seat. You people never learn, do you? More footage. More faces. Names. Dates. Patterns. Each one a stitch in the noose he had tied for himself, slowly, confidently, never imagining that someone had been watching this whole time. Halstead's expression cracked. His breathing grew sharp, uneven. He looked to the judge, to the bailiffs, to the room he once owned. No one said anything, he muttered, you were all fine with it, none of you stopped me, why is this happening now? Imani stepped forward. Because today, you're not protected by silence. You're surrounded by it. The bailiff, now following instructions from Marcus, stepped forward with a fresh pair of cuffs. Halstead stepped back, panic rising in his voice. No, you can't do this here, not in front of everyone. Imani met his eyes. Why not? You did it to me. He didn't resist at first. He was too stunned. The cuffs clicked around his wrists, and for the first time, the courtroom saw what he looked like without his badge acting as a shield. Smaller. Uncertain. Exposed. The same uniform that had made him untouchable now clung to him like a weight. The judge stood from his bench. Officer Halstead, you are being placed in federal custody under suspicion of civil rights violations, obstruction of justice, falsification of evidence, and aggravated assault under color of law. You have the right to remain silent. I know my damn rights, Halstead snapped, voice brittle. Marcus nodded toward the screen. We'll see how much they help you now. As he was escorted from the courtroom, he passed by Imani again. This time, his eyes didn't carry hate. They carried disbelief. He opened his mouth one last time, not with a threat, but a question. Why didn't you say something that morning? She didn't blink. Because you wouldn't have listened. The courtroom didn't erupt in applause. There was no cheer, no celebration. Just silence. A silence that acknowledged something irreversible had happened. The hierarchy had cracked. The untouchable had been touched. The crowd slowly began to process what they had witnessed, not just the fall of a man, but the exposure of a system. Imani remained standing. She wasn't celebrating. She wasn't gloating. There was too much pain in the air for that. Too many names in those files that would never get a moment like this. But this was for them too. Every unspoken story. Every report that never went through. Every mother who got a phone call instead of justice. The judge called for a recess, but no one moved. Not yet. Marcus looked at Imani. You okay? She nodded, but her voice was low. I will be. He packed the laptop, and they exited the courtroom slowly. Outside, the sun was starting to shift in the sky, casting long shadows across the pavement. Reporters were already gathering. Someone had leaked the detainment. The bureau wouldn't be happy about that, but Imani didn't care. Let them talk. But the day wasn't over. Because now that Halstead had been removed, the real war would begin, the one with those who protected him. And Imani wasn't finished. Not even close. The hallway outside the courtroom buzzed with murmurs as word began to spread beyond the walls, trickling into headlines and whispers and stunned faces pressed against cell phone screens. The fall of Officer Ryan Halstead was already gaining traction, his face captured mid-shock, frozen in disbelief, arms restrained, being led away by federal agents like the countless black men and women he had dehumanized with that same authority. But the noise didn't reach Imani as she stepped into the narrow corridor with Marcus by her side. Her heart was a quiet storm, not from adrenaline but from the weight of knowing this wasn't the end. The takedown had been public, intentional, necessary, but it had never been just about Halstead. He was the crack in the surface. Now it was time to dig into the concrete beneath. Marcus stopped walking and looked at her carefully. They're going to come for you now. You just embarrassed an entire department in front of the press, a judge, and half the city. Imani didn't stop moving. Let them. He caught up to her, lowering his voice. You understand the kind of protection Halstead had, right? You saw the way the judge hesitated, how nobody stepped in even when it was clearly wrong. He wasn't acting alone. There's more, and they know who you are now. You're the threat. She turned to him, her jaw tight but her eyes fierce. Then it's time they understand exactly what kind of threat I am. They reached a conference room inside the courthouse that had been temporarily secured for her debriefing. Inside were two agents from Washington, Assistant Director Maria Holt and Supervisory Agent Ron Bellamy. Both had flown in as soon as they saw the video. Imani wasn't surprised. This wasn't the kind of operation the Bureau wanted exposed, not like this. They didn't care that she had been cuffed in front of a room full of people. They cared that it made them look unprepared. Vulnerable. But Imani wasn't interested in their damage control. She had come to finish what she started. Holt didn't waste time. What the hell was that in the courtroom, Agent Walker? Imani sat down slowly, placed her files on the table, and looked her superior in the eye. It was accountability. Something this department hasn't been very familiar with lately. Bellamy crossed his arms, his expression unreadable. You took it public. We gave you authorization for a sealed indictment. You were supposed to coordinate the arrest through proper channels. Imani's voice didn't rise, but her tone turned sharp. Proper channels are what allowed him to stay on the streets after 3 internal complaints. Proper channels let him erase bodycam footage, intimidate witnesses, and walk around knowing that every file I sent would die in someone's inbox. I followed procedure for 16 months. You think I did this because I wanted attention? I did this because if I had waited one more day, he would have buried the last piece of evidence. Holt leaned forward. You humiliated local law enforcement. You embarrassed a judge. You broke rank. No, Imani snapped, leaning forward just enough to meet her halfway. I showed them what it feels like when truth walks into the room and doesn't ask permission. The room went still. Bellamy finally spoke, voice low. And what happens now, Agent Walker? You think they're going to thank you? You think this ends with a commendation? I don't care how it ends, she said. I care that it doesn't keep happening. Marcus broke the tension with a quiet cough before sliding a flash drive across the table. We pulled additional footage from the precinct archives this morning. It confirms cross-referencing with 3 other officers who covered for Halstead. Falsified timestamps. Edited reports. And a network of informal communication that shows a pattern of targeted harassment against black residents, especially women. Holt picked up the drive without a word. Imani looked at both of them. You asked me to expose corruption. I did. Now are you going to act on it, or are we going to pretend that the real problem ended in handcuffs an hour ago? Bellamy hesitated, then nodded slowly. The DOJ will begin formal inquiries into the APD and the handling of internal complaints. But it's going to get ugly. It's already ugly, Imani replied. It's just finally being seen. They left the conference room, walking down the stairwell instead of taking the elevator. Imani didn't say much on the way down. She was steady, but the emotional toll was beginning to weigh on her shoulders. The image of Halstead, the sound of his voice trying to twist her victory into victimhood, it all echoed in her bones. She knew the public reaction wouldn't be simple. There would be backlash. Spin. Character attacks. People would call her emotional, dangerous, unprofessional. But none of that changed what had been done. She had exposed something they wanted hidden, and that always came with a cost. As they reached the first floor, a familiar voice called from behind. It was Lena, the mother of one of the victims from a previous case, a quiet, dignified woman who had fought silently for her son's name to be cleared after a wrongful arrest. Imani had interviewed her months ago. Now she stood in the courthouse hallway with tears welling in her eyes. I saw the video, Lena said softly. I watched them put cuffs on you. And then I saw you take your power back. I wanted to thank you. Imani looked at her, and for the first time that day, her throat tightened. Lena stepped forward and took her hand. They'll try to erase this, Lena whispered. But I won't let them. My son won't let them. We remember. Imani squeezed her hand, voice barely audible. Thank you. Outside the courthouse, the press had gathered in full. Microphones. Cameras. Flashing lights. Questions being shouted over one another. Imani paused at the doors. Marcus leaned in, asking, You sure about this? She nodded once. Let them see the face of someone they tried to silence. They stepped outside together, and the crowd surged. Agent Walker, did you plan this arrest for publicity? Do you regret exposing a fellow law enforcement officer? Are you concerned about your position within the Bureau? She stepped forward, no paper in hand, no speech prepared. Just truth. I don't regret a single step, she said, her voice rising just enough to pierce through the noise. For every person who's ever been dismissed, dehumanized, or handcuffed for existing, I see you. For those who were told to wait, to be quiet, to let the system fix itself, I heard you. And today, I did something about it. There were no more questions. There didn't need to be. Because the story wasn't just about what she had done. It was about what she had survived to get here. What she had exposed. The days that followed were not filled with celebration. They were filled with scrutiny, with tension, with the kind of silence that weighs differently when you're the one who shattered the illusion of order. Imani Walker became the center of a national conversation overnight, not because she had sought the spotlight, but because she had dragged the rod into the light, and now the system didn't know what to do with her. She had done the unthinkable, dismantled a brotherhood from within, publicly, strategically, and without apology. And while some saw her as a hero, others labeled her a traitor, someone who had turned her badge into a weapon against her own. The calls started coming, news outlets, civil rights organizations, even politicians trying to use her name for their causes. Her inbox overflowed with requests for interviews, while anonymous threats crept into her voicemail, each one reminding her that exposure comes with a price. Inside the bureau, the atmosphere shifted. The same agents who once nodded respectfully in the hallway now kept their eyes low or avoided her altogether. Conversations stopped when she entered a room. Meetings were moved without notice. And in those moments, Imani realized that taking down Halstead had triggered something deeper, it had pierced through the veil of quiet corruption, and the fallout was just beginning. She wasn't afraid, but she was alert. Every gesture, every look, every email felt like a test. She was being watched, measured, and in some cases, set up to fall. But the truth was, she had been under the microscope since day one. This was just more visible now. She sat in her office late one evening, the city buzzing faintly through the window behind her, the lights of Atlanta casting long shadows across her desk. Marcus sat across from her, his face worn with the exhaustion of someone who had stood too close to the fire but chose not to walk away. The silence between them wasn't uncomfortable, it was heavy with decisions. On the desk sat a file that hadn't been opened yet. Inside, were names, 3 officers from the same precinct as Halstead, each with internal complaints buried under layers of edits and omissions. One of them, a captain. Another, an IA investigator who had conveniently lost multiple reports. The third, a community outreach liaison who had rewritten witness statements. Imani hadn't opened it yet because she already knew what was inside. Proof that Halstead wasn't just an isolated incident. He was part of a structure. Marcus finally spoke, his voice low. If you move on them, you might not make it out with your badge. She looked at him, the file still untouched. I didn't come this far to stop at one. He leaned forward, fingers interlocked, his eyes searching hers. You have to think long-term now. You exposed a system, but the system still has teeth. If they take your credibility, your clearance, your authority, who's left to hold the line? She stood and walked to the window, arms folded tightly across her chest. The city moved below her, indifferent, unaware of the war being waged behind glass and concrete. What good is a badge if it only works when you're quiet? He didn't answer. Because deep down, he knew she was right. The moral line began to blur the deeper she went. Every piece of evidence led to more names, more decisions that weren't simply about right or wrong, but about who was willing to sacrifice what for truth. The DOJ had opened an official investigation into the Atlanta Police Department, but Imani knew that wasn't enough. Formal inquiries moved at the pace of politics. What she had in her hands wasn't just evidence, it was power. And power, she had learned, didn't always come with protection. She was called into a meeting the next day with the Bureau's regional director, a man who had served over 30 years and wore his experience like a warning. The room was cold. Sterile. He didn't offer her a seat. She took one anyway. On the table, beside a glass of water that no one touched, sat a printed copy of the video that had gone viral. Her arrest. Halstead's words. The badge reveal. The stunned courtroom. The bureau emblem flickered on the screen behind him, and he began to speak. You put us in a difficult position. She didn't flinch. I did my job. He nodded slowly, almost mockingly. You did your job, loudly. Imani narrowed her gaze. Loud enough to be heard. He exhaled, sitting down finally. You want the truth. I admire what you did. But this agency runs on balance. Quiet. Strategy. We don't bring fire to courtrooms. Maybe we should, she replied, voice steady. You have two options, he said, leaning forward. We can position this as an act of bravery, an isolated incident. You get a commendation, a transfer, maybe even a book deal someday. Or, you keep digging. You go after names that go deeper than precinct politics. You start making enemies in places where enemies don't wear uniforms. And when that happens, no one will protect you, not even us. The message was clear. Silence, and be celebrated. Or speak, and be erased. When she left that room, she wasn't angry. She was resolved. Because now the fight was no longer just about Halstead or the badge. It was about what kind of world she was willing to leave behind. What kind of woman she refused to become. Lena called her again that night. Her voice was tired but strong. I watched the news, she said. They're saying you crossed a line. Imani sat on her living room floor, the file still unopened beside her. Maybe I did. No, Lena said firmly. They just never expected you to draw one. The words sank deep. The next morning, Imani walked into her office, placed the unopened file at the center of her desk, and began to read. Every page, every redaction, every falsified timestamp was a name she now carried. Not as a burden, but as a responsibility. She didn't know what the next step would be. But she knew this wasn't the end. It couldn't be. Because something bigger had started the moment she stood up in that courtroom. A shift. A reckoning. And now, it was up to her to decide whether to close the file and protect herself, or open it and finish the fight. And as the clock ticked on the wall, the weight of the decision filled the room like a storm just waiting to break. The question wasn't whether she would move. It was how far she'd be willing to go. The weight of the open file consumed the room. The pages weren't just ink and paper, they were confessions in disguise, secrets dressed up as reports, truth buried beneath bureaucratic language. Imani sat in her office for hours, barely blinking, her fingers tracing the edges of every sheet, every altered timestamp, every missing signature. It was all right there, names, positions, badges. 3 officers directly connected to Halstead, and several more lurking in the shadows, each of them tethered to the same methods, the same language, the same calculated violence dressed up as routine enforcement. This wasn't just about one precinct or one man, this was a culture. A system within the system. One that adapted, protected itself, erased what it didn't want seen, and punished anyone who dared to tell the truth. And now the decision sat entirely on her shoulders. Her phone vibrated on the desk. It was Marcus. She didn't answer. She couldn't. Not yet. She needed silence. But it buzzed again, and again, until finally she picked up, pressing it to her ear without speaking. You saw the file, Marcus said. His voice wasn't a question. It was a statement soaked in concern. I saw your badge access this morning. She still didn't say anything. You're not planning to go public with this yet, are you? Her silence stretched, but eventually she spoke, slow and heavy. If I stop now, it was all for nothing. There was a pause on the line, then the low rustle of him shifting in his chair. Imani, listen to me. We did what we came here to do. Halstead's gone. The department's under investigation. The DOJ is involved. If you blow this open now, you won't just lose your job. You'll lose your leverage. You'll lose any power you have left inside. I don't want leverage, she said. I want accountability. He exhaled sharply. There's a difference between justice and martyrdom. She looked out the window, eyes scanning the parking lot below like she was searching for something to anchor her. I know. But right now, I'm not sure which one they're willing to give me. Marcus didn't answer that. He just sat in the quiet with her. Then, softer, he asked, what if we do it another way? Quietly. Strategic leaks. Controlled channels. We can still protect you. No, she said. I don't need protection. I need the truth to have a voice. She ended the call and sat back in her chair. The room felt colder than usual, but maybe that was just the gravity of what she was about to do. She spent the next 2 hours drafting a report, not internal, not coded, not buried under red tape. A clear, direct account of every falsified file, every ignored complaint, every officer connected to the chain of abuse. No embellishments. No opinions. Just facts, strung together so clearly that anyone who read them would understand the scope. Then she attached supporting evidence, audio clips, internal memos, photos, testimonies, copies of redacted forms and their unedited versions. She created a file that no one could ignore. But before she could send it, she paused. Because sending that file wouldn't just expose others, it would paint a target on her back in ways she couldn't yet measure. And that's when the dilemma cracked open wider than ever before. She could publish everything, name every name, destroy careers and dismantle lies. But in doing so, she might lose the one thing she'd fought so hard to build, her place on the inside. And without that, who would be left to keep watch? Who would catch the next Halstead before the cuffs went on someone else's wrists? There was a knock on her door. Soft. Hesitant. It opened slowly, and Lena stepped inside, her hands wrapped around a worn folder. Imani hadn't seen her in days. Lena looked tired, her face lined with quiet grief, but her eyes still held that unyielding fire, the kind only a mother who's survived injustice could carry. I heard you're still fighting, she said, closing the door behind her. Imani stood slowly, unsure how to respond. I brought you something, Lena continued, holding out the folder. It's my son's report. The one they made me sign. I've read it 100 times. Every time, it reads like someone else's story. Like my boy was a criminal before he ever made a mistake. Imani took the folder gently, flipping it open. It was thin. Deceptively simple. But as she read, she saw the same patterns, language that painted fear instead of fact, sanitized violence, erased context. They told me it was standard, Lena said, voice trembling but controlled. But when I saw what you did, when I saw you stand there, silent, unshaken, I realized I was never crazy. I wasn't the only one. Imani looked at her, the words catching in her throat. You were never alone. You just didn't have someone on the inside saying it. Lena nodded slowly. So say it. Say it loud. Not just for my son. For all of them. Because if you don't, this file will be the only truth anyone ever sees about him. Imani looked down at the folder in her hands and knew she couldn't hold both safety and justice at once. One would require her silence. The other would demand everything else. That night, she didn't go home. She stayed in her office, lights off, staring at the screen. Her finger hovered over the mouse, the cursor blinking above the submit button of a secure upload portal she had routed through an encrypted server. It wasn't official. It wasn't bureau-sanctioned. But it was safe. Independent journalists. Civil rights lawyers. Internal watchdog groups. The ones who don't blink when the truth gets ugly. The file was ready. The question wasn't whether it should be shared. The question was whether she could carry what came next. She clicked. The upload began. And as the bar inched forward, her body stilled. Not out of fear, but resolve. Because what she had done in that courtroom had exposed one man. But what she had done tonight, that was about to shake the foundation. The upload completed at 3:17 a.m. Imani sat still, her fingers resting gently on the edge of the desk, her eyes locked on the screen as if waiting for something to explode. But there was no sound. No alarm. Just the faint hum of the office lights and the slow, pulsing weight of what she had just done. The file was out. Not locked in a government vault. Not hidden in a back channel. Out in the world, accessible, undeniable, irreversible. The names, the records, the evidence of manipulation and abuse, the lies dressed as procedure, the truth sharpened like glass. Her breath was steady, but inside her chest, something felt raw, like the moment right after a deep wound begins to bleed, not from pain, but from the certainty that you can't go back now. The choice was made. And all she could do was brace for what came next. By morning, the response had already begun. Her phone lit up with messages, most of them short, frantic, some in code. Marcus called twice, then texted. "Call me now. It's out." She didn't answer right away. She needed a moment longer to sit in the quiet before the chaos hit. But when she finally picked up, Marcus didn't even say hello. "You really did it," he said, not with anger, not with fear, but something like awe. "It's everywhere. Twitter. Reddit. Internal forums. Journalists are reaching out. You named names, Imani. High-ranking ones. Do you understand what they're going to do now?" She stood by her window, watching as a gray overcast sky blanketed the city. "They were going to come for me anyway," she said. "Now they just have to do it in public." There was a pause on the other end. Then Marcus's voice lowered. "You're not safe." "I was never safe," she replied. "I was just quiet." He exhaled slowly, frustrated. "You should have told me." "I couldn't," she said. "Because I needed it to be my decision." Outside, her office building's parking lot was beginning to fill. Suits walking briskly under umbrellas, unaware that the air around them had changed. By noon, the first official statement dropped, a vague acknowledgement from the Bureau that documents of concern had been leaked, followed by a promise of comprehensive internal review. It was hollow. Safe. Predictable. But the leak was too large to contain. Journalists had already begun cross-referencing documents. Advocacy groups had begun calling for resignations. Protesters were gathering outside precinct buildings across the city. The silence was broken. The veil lifted. But the moment that hit hardest didn't come from the press. It came from a phone call routed through the Bureau's internal system, marked urgent, restricted ID. Imani answered on instinct, not recognizing the voice at first. "You don't know me," the voice said, shaky, raw, male, probably late 20s. "But you interviewed me, last year. You came to my neighborhood. You asked about Officer Jalen Price." Imani straightened, memories beginning to fire. Price had been one of the officers she'd connected to Halstead through informal intimidation reports. The man on the phone had been listed only as a potential witness, too afraid to sign anything. "I remember," she said gently. "I just wanted to say. I saw the files. The ones you leaked. That was me in there, wasn't it? The report they changed. The camera footage that disappeared." She closed her eyes, pain pressing behind them. "Yes. It was you." There was a long silence. "Then, I thought I was crazy. They made me feel like I imagined the whole thing. I told my mom I was wrong. That I'd overreacted. But I knew. And you believed me. Even when I couldn't say it. Her voice trembled. "I'm sorry they made you feel like that." "No," he said, firmer now. "Don't be. You gave me my name back." After the call ended, Imani sat in the stillness again, tears falling silently down her cheeks. Not from regret, but from the sheer magnitude of what truth costs, and what it gives back. One voice. One life. One person who no longer felt erased. But the storm was coming. At 2:43 p.m., she received the formal notification, an immediate administrative leave pending an internal review of conduct inconsistent with FBI protocol. It was dressed in cold, polite language. No direct mention of the leak. No outright accusation. But it didn't need one. Everyone knew what it meant. The door was closing. They were trying to shut her down before the walls crumbled completely. Marcus met her at the office elevator as she packed the last of her things. "They're scared," he said, standing beside her as the floor indicator ticked down. "That's why they're rushing. They think if they bury you fast enough, they can bury the story." She looked at him. "They can bury me. But the truth's already out." "I want to fight," he said. "I want to help. But this is war now." She didn't answer at first. Then finally, "I know." They walked through the lobby together, eyes following them from every corner. Some with sympathy. Some with fear. Some with judgment. She didn't care anymore. She stepped out into the street as chants began to rise from the crowd on the sidewalk. A line of signs. A circle of people. Faces she didn't recognize. Voices she hadn't heard before. But they were there, holding space, holding her. One woman reached out and touched her arm as she passed. "We got you," she said. "Whatever they try next, we're watching now." Imani paused, nodded, and kept walking. Not because she was running. But because she knew the next battle was already forming. Later that night, back in her apartment, she sat at the table with a single lamp casting a soft glow. She hadn't spoken to her mother in days. Hadn't slept more than a few hours since the hearing. The noise hadn't stopped. But for a moment, she allowed herself stillness. Then her phone rang again. Private number. She hesitated, then answered. The voice was male. Measured. Controlled. Agent Walker. Or should I say, former agent. She didn't respond. "You've made quite the mess," the voice continued. "And you've made some very powerful people uncomfortable." She leaned forward, voice calm. "Good. You think you're untouchable now? You think just because people are marching in the streets, we're afraid?" She smiled slowly. "No. I think you're panicking. And I think you're calling me in the middle of the night because you don't know what I'm going to do next." There was silence on the other end. Then a quiet click. The line went dead. She sat back, heart steady, breath even. She had just begun. The storm didn't settle quietly. The aftermath came in waves, public hearings, national coverage, legal battles stacked one after the other like dominoes waiting for gravity to finish what truth had started. Imani Walker was no longer an agent with a desk or a badge. They stripped her of that the same week the Bureau held their press conference, a carefully curated statement read by someone who had never faced what she endured. But what they failed to understand, what they had always underestimated, was that power doesn't come from a title. It comes from credibility, from voice, from action. And by the time they tried to silence her, it was already too late. The nation had seen her. The people had decided what she stood for. And more importantly, the truth had rooted itself in the soil of public consciousness. It could no longer be uprooted. Within 2 months, multiple officers tied to the exposed documents were either suspended or placed under formal investigation. The city appointed a civilian review board with real authority, something community leaders had begged for over a decade. The Department of Justice expanded their probe beyond Atlanta, tracing patterns in similar precincts across other states. It became something larger than Imani had even planned. The ripples kept moving, reshaping laws, redrawing boundaries, forcing conversations in spaces where silence had once ruled. And as the headlines kept spinning, her name remained attached to all of it, not as a scandal, but as a symbol. But perhaps the most surprising twist came from within the bureau itself. Maria Holt, the assistant director who once scolded Imani behind closed doors, was removed following a leaked email that revealed she had known about several of the redacted files for years. Her silence had been part of the cover. Her removal sent a message, that the old ways weren't just being challenged, they were being dismantled. Marcus didn't stay in the bureau either. He resigned quietly after delivering his final report, then reappeared months later as the co-founder of a nonprofit aimed at supporting whistleblowers inside federal institutions. He and Imani hadn't spoken much in the immediate aftermath, not out of anger, but because they had both gone through something that only time could help process. But eventually, they met again, across a round table at a conference about reform, where she was now the keynote speaker. He looked at her, then, with something deeper than pride. Something like peace. As for Halstead, his trial was a spectacle. Broadcasted. Dissected. He sat behind a defense team that tried to spin his actions into misunderstandings, into policy misinterpretations. But the evidence was unshakable. His smirk never returned. The footage spoke louder than he ever could. He was found guilty on multiple counts, civil rights violations, falsifying reports, obstruction. But what broke him wasn't the sentence. It was the fact that no one came to his defense. No blue wall. No quiet nods. No alliances. Just silence. Cold, deliberate, and complete. And Imani, what became of her? She became what they feared most. She didn't disappear. She rose. She published a memoir titled The Quiet Badge, which became a bestseller not because it was sensational, but because it was honest. It wasn't about revenge, it was about responsibility. About what it costs to tell the truth in a world built to protect the lie. She traveled. Spoke. Sat in rooms with people who used to ignore her voice and watched them shift uncomfortably under the weight of her presence. She founded a new organization called Echo Justice, focused on amplifying suppressed voices within systems of authority. Within a year, her name was mentioned alongside leaders who had sparked national change, not because she planned it, but because she refused to be silent. And maybe the most poetic part of her journey wasn't the courtroom or the book or the awards. It was the letters she received, dozens, then hundreds, from people who had never filed a complaint, who had once believed their voices didn't matter, now saying they were ready to speak. Ready to name their pain. Because someone like her had stood in silence once, and turned that silence into something unstoppable. Now, to you, watching this, listening to this story unfold, take a breath. Sit with what you've just witnessed. This wasn't fiction for fiction's sake. This was a mirror, a pulse, a truth echoing from somewhere deeper. How many times do we see injustice dressed up as authority? How often do we look away, afraid of what might happen if we speak? But what happens when someone chooses not to look away? What happens when one voice, steady and relentless, says enough? Ask yourself, would you risk everything to expose what no one else has the courage to face? Would you stand when silence is the safer choice? And if someone like Imani Walker existed in your world, would you stand beside her? Tell us in the comments what part of this story struck you hardest. Was it the courtroom reversal? The risk of telling the truth? The cost of defiance? We want to hear your thoughts, your feelings, your voice, because every story like this carries something for each of us to unpack. And if you felt something here, if this story made you pause, made you think, made you feel, then subscribe to Tales of Twist. This is where truth meets storytelling, where justice isn't a concept, it's a journey. And the next chapter? It's waiting for you. Don't forget to like, comment, and hit that subscribe button. We'll see you in the next story.